Hey there, I'm Sharon Welch, and welcome to A Brave Journey, the podcast to help you throw out those legacy belief and identity stories that you've been lugging around on autopilot for decades, so you can jump back in the driver's seat of your aliveness again. When you change your mind, you change your life. Are you ready? Let's get into it. It'll be fun. So I want to apologize in advance if the background noise is distracting to you and you hear what you believe is gunshots. I can assure you that they are not. Here in Nicaragua, they are a very joyful people, and often there's a lot of loud music and also fireworks, particularly bottle rockets, going off for no apparent reason. And they're even accelerated when we are in the holiday season. So if you do hear that in the background, never fear. I am safe. You're just hearing people celebrate. So last time, as we started talking about belief systems, one of the things I indicated I wanted to dive into was this idea of conforming for comfort. I facilitated a conversation a while back with a group I was hosting about this topic, and it was spurred by an article called The Conformity Bind by an author and researcher named Michelle King. And she was talking about how common it was for ideal employees to achieve success within their organizations by conforming to the norms of the company. And so when they would do this, they found that they could more easily build social capital, get better access to mentors, powerful connections, all of that sort of thing. And it struck me that what is true in the corporate world is really also largely true and what we do in our everyday lives. So we talked about how we inherit these belief systems, and we go along with those belief systems because that is what makes us feel accepted and safe. So it stands to reason that really what we're doing is conforming for comfort. It becomes a survival for us to develop what I'll call these facades so that we can get ahead. But what's interesting in the research was that denying our identities didn't actually make them disappear. It just really caused us to put on layer after layer of these facades, which is why many times you will have situation or many situations or times in your life where you feel a little uncomfortable in your own skin, or you just feel like maybe something's off, and it's because these facades, the weight of these facades finally kind of breaks through to the surface. So I wanted to have a conversation with this group, and I thought it was so pertinent to what we're discussing here on A Brave Journey that I wanted to do a replay of it here. The quote that really hooked me in on this article and this research, this topic for discussion was, quote, "Trying to pretend to be someone else is an exhausting and demoralizing process," end quote. Think about that. All of us at one time or another, if not 24/7, have been forced into, conditioned into, obligated into being someone that we're not, usually to conform for comfort. So this really kind of hit hard to think about that, how heavy, how onerous those facades are that we carry around with ourselves. So I would really love to hear your thoughts after you listen in on this conversation that we facilitated on this topic, and hear your own experiences with conforming for comfort and what you did about it or what you didn't do about it and why.
All right. So let's go ahead and get started. So there was some interest earlier this week to talk about this idea of conformity for comfort. And so, a couple weeks ago, we posted an article in the group that was talking about this idea that when you go into a new company, but really it's truly when you go into any new sort of organization. I mean, you could think of it as maybe when you join a new church or a new sports group, or you go back to school or something like that. You get in there, and as the new person, there seems to be this sort of persona. You can call it the ideal target, the ideal avatar, that person, and what the expectation is for when you get there. You really see it, though, in corporations, but you can apply the same idea. You get in there, and, as human beings, we all want to belong. So the first thing we do is figure out what those norms are, and then we try to model that so that we are part of the whole. At least at first, you don't really want to stand out, if that makes sense. So that conformity is something that you kind of see happens everywhere in life. And it's almost a little alarming how close the word conform and comfort really are, right? And they do tend to be related. If you think about it, conformity really comes in two flavors. There's a surface conformity, and we'll talk about what that is. And then there's the more internalized, the deeper core conformity. And those are the areas I think where it's important to pay attention to and really ask yourself some questions to figure out why you do some of the things you do. So if you look at conformity from an external perspective, sort of a surface perspective, we're talking about things like societal norms. Like in the US, we drive on the right side of the road. You conform to that because to not do that is chaos, and probably you're going to cause an accident. So things like how we drive, some of the laws we have, how we are willing to, without needing to be told, stand in a line and understand that we wait our turn, those sort of things. And can also be things that aren't necessarily related to order in our society, but things that for whatever reason we don't think twice about, but somehow we have become conditioned to go along with. Here's a great example. And I would challenge you. It's kind of fun. If you've never done this before, just go live in that discomfort. Get into an elevator and face the back. I'm saying it's really uncomfortable. We have a lot of things that there's no safety reason. There's no legal reason why you need to face forward in an elevator. You can absolutely face the back, make eye contact with everyone else in the elevator, and it's super uncomfortable. But that's a societal norm. So that is something we conform to just because we're on autopilot. So if you're ever feeling particularly, plucky, ornery, right? You can do those sort of things and just see that as you walk through your life, and we talk a lot about in this group the idea that we do tend to get on autopilot because it's a shortcut for us. So I think I talked about last week that we have in place these shortcuts, this shorthand in our head that allows us just to do things without thinking about it, because we all have too many things to think about as it is, right? So, but these are another one of those things. Or if you've been in the corporate world and you go to a meeting like in the boardroom, or you go to a community thing where people meet regularly, and you'll find that people tend to sit like it becomes their chair, right? It's somewhere at the table. Or maybe it's at your family dinner table. Everybody has their seat. There's really no rhyme or reason why you need to conform to that. But over time, that's become a habit, and that's become a conformity that you do because you're on autopilot and you need a shorthand in your life to have that order. So try sitting in a different place at the table. I mean, I think sometimes the reaction is you just drown someone's cat, right? It's terrible. People just they can't do that. So that's kind of a surface kind of conformity. And a lot of that, we do have to conform to those things just to kind of be a citizen of our world, just to be parts of our families or our churches or our workplaces, or safety things that we do. But the other side of conformity is that more internalized thing. So that really is more like we talked about, the idea of conforming in a corporate environment. And as women, this is something to pay attention to, because those environments, in many cases, I don't want to overgeneralize, but they do tend to be a little more structured from a masculine perspective. So a lot of things that might come natural to a woman, that might come natural to people that are less masculine, frankly, are not the kind of things that are the norm when you're in a corporate environment. So there tends to be, particularly in large corporations, an expectation that you are hard charging, you're always working, you appear to have no outside life. There's all of these things. It's very competitive, and it's very, there's all of these things that go on. And so over time, you do that as a shorthand to get along. But at some point, you're going to want to pause and say, are these things that are coming in conflict with the values that I have, or the values that I want to be living that I'm not actually able to? You'll see the same thing. The internalized idea of conformity was really more about how you think about things. So the workplace is one, but another one might be when you belong to a church or when you go to school. There are things that it's easier, or it's a shorthand to just default to going with what the majority says, because that's how you belong. There's studies that were done in elementary schools all over the place where they looked at what it was that children would say was the answer or opinion on something. And literally 80% of the time, even if they hadn't thought about it, whatever most of the class was saying, that's what they would say. And initially it's a belonging thing. But then at some point, if you don't go back and check in on that, like once you're an adult, then it really does become part of your belief system. And you forget it. Absolutely, conformity is safer. That's the thing. And, we always talk about this idea about, the critter brain telling us, oh, well, I can't have change. I can't stand out because that's how I die. Right. And so we're wired that way. So when you're in a group of people, in a school, in your work, in your church, frankly, in your family, think how many times you just sort of go along to get along. But at some point, it stops being just that. It really starts to color your belief system. So if you remember, we've talked about how you inherit your belief system sometime between the ages of 4 and 7. And then you literally spend the rest of your life having that reinforced from your family of origin, from your community, from the media. And then as you become an adult and you really sort of have your own purposeful thoughts, we also want to be right. So we will go find, it's sort of that idea that it's the confirmation bias. We will go find reasons or examples of why our way of thinking is right, purely because we want to be right. So at some point as an adult, if you're feeling that sense of, you're just feeling a little uncomfortable in your skin, or there's something that's rubbing you the wrong way about a way that you are living or a way that you're thinking about things, a lot of times it's because you have spent a lot of time doing the care and feeding of a belief system that no longer works for you. So this idea of conformity is really tied into that, because a lot of these things, aside from the general stuff that we do related to safety, law and order, those things we talked about, a lot of the conformity that we do really does serve the function of reinforcing our belief systems, or adding on to the home of our, adding a new wing onto our belief systems. And we don't even realize that it's happened. But what we know at some point is in those kind of quiet moments, whenever we can get those, we realize that something does feel a little bit off, or, we're in a work situation, or there's something happening in our family, and we know how we really feel about it, and we know what we really want to say. And then we pause because you don't want to make the drama. You don't want it to be difficult. It takes energy to do it. Yes, absolutely. So Judy, that's a perfect example as far as confirmation bias. It's really easy to get into an echo chamber in those same things. And you go through the internet, you find what needs to be true. You can find 10 things that say you're right. You can find 100 things that say you're wrong, but you're going to show those 10 things as the way to be right. And so as we get in these situations with our families, in our workplace, in our communities, where the going along at some point begins to feel uncomfortable for us, then you're at a crossroads. And then you have to decide. You have to decide, is it worth it to me? Do I place enough value on this particular belief, on this particular situation, on this particular thought or action or whatever it is that you're conforming to, going along with? Do I put enough importance on it that I'm willing to think about it differently and maybe step outside that comfort zone? And it's another one of those things where, you've got that critter brain in the back of you telling you, oh my gosh, don't rock the boat. This will never end well. And you almost just have to tone that down. Like we talked about last week, those voices are like needy children. If you remember, if you've been around small children, raised small children, a lot of times they just want attention. So they're tugging at you. Look at me. I'm doing this. A lot of times, all it takes is directly acknowledge them, thank them, and then send them on their way. So you can do the same thing with those voices, but you kind of have to make a value judgment about which of those things just need to stay on autopilot. You just need to have those shortcuts. They make sense from a safety perspective. They make sense from a law and order perspective. They make sense from it's not important to your life perspective. And I'm just going to let that one be on autopilot because I can't control the universe. That's a hard one for me because, up until I became a recovering superwoman, controlling the universe was absolutely my job. So I resigned from that job a couple of years ago, and it's been amazing, FYI. So if you hold down that job too, you might want to consider it. But when you look at these things that you're feeling uncomfortable about, whether it's speaking up at work, doing things in a different way, bringing your whole self to whatever that is in your family, in your community, where you really feel like you've had to meet yourself, then you have to decide, is it worth it for me to put that out there? And it's scary, right? And because it's unfamiliar and we're not used to doing it, it can feel really vulnerable. And then it's a personal decision about what you do about that. But I mean, I've certainly found that by deciding which of those things are important to me, the more you do it, the easier it becomes. Have any of you ever had that experience where you finally got to a point where denying how you really felt about something or feeling conflicted about a belief, where you just finally had to make that decision? Have any of you ever had that experience? Because I kind of have an interesting thought about if you've considered it, but not really experienced it. I have something for you to think about. So Judy says, yep, held back the voices for a long time. They really are like holding back a pressure cooker. The other way I think about it is it's like a sapling. Like you can pull a sapling all the way down to the ground. At some point, it has to come back up. So same with the pressure cooker, it has to recalibrate, right? Yeah. And I agree that that's a really good point, Judy, is that sometimes Judy says it's better to let your voice be heard in small ways rather than to just, go all out, burn the bridges, let go of all the pressure all at once. And honestly, it's sort of an in the moment call about what's going to work best. But I think it's sort of like anything. If you're trying to develop a new habit or you want to do things differently, it's those incremental steps. And like we talk about when you're looking at any sort of transformation or any sort of habit change, if you can just do the next thing, then the thing after that becomes clear once you're that person that did the next thing. So this idea of doing the small things to get where you need to go is absolutely, because a lot of times that fear and that vulnerability does come from overwhelm. So that's a really good point, Judy. The other thing that I'll put out there as something to consider is sometimes I had this experience. So my story will tend to come out over the next several months, just various things I call my life quakes for how I ended up on this journey I've been on the last couple of years. So one of the short little vignettes about that is I was doing an overseas assignment in Australia, and I had a boss who turned out, really textbook sociopath. And unfortunately, because I pushed back on some things that just morally and from a business perspective seemed wrong, I spoke up. At the time, I didn't realize he was a sociopath, but by speaking up, that actually made me a target. So my life became very difficult. But what was interesting was the easiest thing for me to do would have been to go along so that I could survive. And I tried to do that for a little while until I started to recognize that there were other people in the office who would use my office as a refuge. And they would come in to check in and like, hey, I'm not crazy, right? Like we're not actually crazy, are we? Like, didn't this happen? And am I really that incompetent? So I started to recognize this. And at some point, my critter brain desire to protect myself got overruled by this desire as I saw that there was these other people who had different strengths, but maybe not the same strengths as me. I had an opportunity to use the strengths that I did have to be an advocate and to be the person who stepped out there away from the crowd to be the target. And for me, that was just one of those clarion moments where I realized I had to choose the unsafe. I had to choose the scary option because I knew, number one, there was no way I could stay in that situation. I was literally on the bottom of the world, thousands of miles from my support system. There was no way I could stay in that situation. And number two, I saw all these other people who also were in this quandary about, do I stay with conformity and autopilot or not? And with nobody making decisions, finally I had to make a decision. And I took that step out there and sort of took the flak for those people. So that's a really dramatic example. But if you think about the places where there is a groupthink or there isn't conformity going on that's not related to safety or law and order or those sort of things, if you think about the number of people who maybe don't have the bravery or the confidence that we do, because I know we all do. I know what kind of women we are. We get scared, of course, but I know that deep down in our core, we can draw up that strength that we need. If you think about the people that are around you, that all they need is that one person who does it first, then you're going to find potentially an entire tribe of people who just breathe out a sigh of relief, and then they can come and then they can feel like they can do that too. So sometimes by continuing to mute our power and our strength and our perspective and our sort of awareness that this stuff happens, because we're ones who are constantly, doing the personal development and learning about these things, we don't want to be in that position where we deprive the people around us from the benefit of that work that we've done. So just another thing to think about when you start to pay attention as you walk through the world, where are those places where I'm conforming? And does it make sense to me or does it not? And I'm telling you, and some of it's kind of funny, right? Some of it, if you're not really quite ready to figure out what are those ones that are the internalized types of conformity, it is really fun to do some of these other things that aren't going to break the law or, ruin law and order or anything. But yeah, turning backwards in an elevator, sitting in a different spot at your family dinner table. It's hilarious. It's hilarious how often we do it. So, and Judy, yeah, you're exactly right. Women are often seen as over emotional. And it's interesting. It's a catch-22. If you show emotion, you're over emotional and weak. If you don't, frankly, you're a bitch, right? Sorry, you're bossy. Instead of assertive, you're bossy. So you almost can't win. So at some point, you just got to own the fact that you're not going to win. So it's kind of like back in the day where if you dressed like I think in high school, if you dressed really conservatively, you were a prude. And if you dressed in a way that flattered your body, well, clearly you were a slut. We can't win. That's okay. So we just need to recognize that. And since you can't win anyway, seems like you just might as well be yourself because, if you're going to lose anyway, why not lose the way you want to lose, right? I mean, that's kind of the way I look at it. So I don't know if any of you have thought of any places where either you've experienced conformity that didn't make sense and you changed it, or if now through this conversation, you're starting to think about, oh, yeah, why do I go along with that? I don't even like that, or I don't agree with that, or that's not who I am. So Lainey's asking, do you think people make changes gradually, or is it something you just wake up one day and snap? Lainey, I think it's both. So it's interesting you asked this question because, part of being, not just a coach, but anyone who is out there where the product is you. So the product is me. You see all these tutorials that tell you that you have to have this hero's journey. You have to have the dramatic, I'm on Oprah moment. On April 23rd, I woke up and the sun was out and I had this lightning bolt and fairies flew around or whatever it is. I felt really bad about myself and I had a huge lack of confidence because I didn't feel like I had that dramatic. I could not pinpoint it to a thing. Now I know at some point with all my life quakes, I got angry and that was a good, big motivating factor for me to do something else. But I think it can be either way. I think there are definitely people who have those moments where it just all comes together for them. Maybe they had a diagnosis for a terrible disease. Maybe they came through, they lost a job or they lost a home or they lost a loved one to death or, there's so many other dramatic things where people just snap out of something right away. But I think for most of us, when we don't have that, it almost feels like our journey is less valuable or we deserve mediocre because we didn't have to survive a deadly disease. We didn't have to overcome a physical trauma. We didn't have to be homeless. And so it's almost like we don't deserve to do something different. But I think that for 99% of the population, change comes gradually. And like I was saying earlier, it really is that thing where if you have this vision for who you are and who you're trying to back to living as, you're not going to necessarily know the whole journey. And frankly, you're probably not going to know the actual outcome because who you are today, 1,000 steps down the road, is a completely different person than who you'll be then. So it's what is that next thing that you're going to do while you're this person and you're going to take that next step. And that literally changes you. So by the time you get to that next step, arguably, you're a different person with a slightly different perspective. So if you would have planned 3 steps from the person at step 0, step 2 and 3 may not be in alignment for you once you get there. So there is something to be said about incremental change. Because if you just make the next step every time you get a step ahead, then you'll find that you're always doing the next aligned step. And when you look back, what you originally thought was your vision may have changed. Maybe it didn't, but maybe it did change. And that's okay because you're committed to the journey and not necessarily the outcome. You know the general direction, but it's impossible really for you to even conceive necessarily of that final outcome. A person who was 5 steps, 10 steps, 150 steps away from that outcome. And usually, because I always say, if you can imagine it, you absolutely can do it. That's not the issue. It's not that you can't do it, but it's that until you are closer to that person, you're going to imagine something different. So I think it really could be both ways. And if it's not a big bang, I think the important thing is don't take that personally. Don't feel that makes your change any less than anyone else's, because most of us are that way. Most of us don't have the big flashy moment. So that was a huge relief to get rid of that hang up that I had for a while working with I'm actually working with a storyteller to help me with that, because I did have a lot of fear and lack of confidence around that. So change is definitely incremental. One of the things that you learn when people who need the most change and the most transformation are the ones who can handle the least of it. So the more things are overwhelming in your life, the less change you can handle at one time. Makes sense, right? I mean, if you're overwhelmed, the thought of having to do 10 other things, you're just not going to do it. You just don't have the bandwidth for it. So if all you have to do is that one thing, you do the one thing. Anybody can do one thing. 5 minutes, 30 seconds a day, something like that. So it's really easy for us to come up with a list of things that we're doing wrong and where we lack, where we've fallen short. I totally agree with you. I kind of talked about this a little bit earlier this week about, some of that comes down to gratitude. Take the wins, be grateful. These are all things that they do. It's like a bank account. You build that up, the hits feel far less, for sure. For sure.
So after listening into that, what do you think? Conforming for comfort. It makes sense, right? I think we've all done it. Again, I would love to hear your thoughts on it. Until next time. Hey, thanks for listening to A Brave Journey. I'm so happy we're here. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to follow and leave a review, and share this with a friend who could benefit too. See you next time.